The feared Alpha King, known for his strength and ruthlessness, halts when he sees a weary horse struggling to pull a broken wagon through the forest. Expecting supplies or spoils inside, he forces it open, only to find a fragile woman and her starving child hiding within. The sight pierces his hardened heart, awakening a side of him no one believed existed. What begins as pity becomes destiny, as the Alpha King claims not treasure, but the family he never knew he needed. But what dark secret from the woman's past could threaten to destroy the one chance at happiness the Alpha King never thought he deserved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. King Aldric Ravencrest ruled the Northern Territories with an iron fist wrapped in shadows and legend. For 23 years, his name had been whispered in taverns and spoken in hushed tones around hearthfires, always with a mixture of reverence and terror. The obsidian crown that adorned his head bore the weight of absolute power, its dark stones reflecting nothing, much like the eyes of the man who wore it. Standing 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the burden of an entire kingdom, Aldric possessed the kind of presence that made grown warriors step aside without a word. His black hair, streaked with premature silver from the weight of leadership, was always pulled back severely, revealing a face carved from granite and marked by battles both physical and political. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw served as a permanent reminder of the day he'd earned his throne through blood and determination. The castle of Ravencrest Keep loomed over the landscape like a predator surveying its domain. Built from black stone, quarried from the northern mountains, its towers pierced the sky like accusations against the heavens. Within its walls, servants moved with practiced silence, understanding that their king valued efficiency over conversation, results over pleasantries. Even his most trusted advisors chose their words carefully in his presence, knowing that Aldric's patience for incompetence had been exhausted long before he'd reached his 35th year. This particular morning found the Alpha King in his private study, reviewing reports from his border patrols. The Northern Territories had enemies on 3 sides, requiring constant vigilance and strategic thinking that had shaped Aldric into a master of warfare and political maneuvering. He'd never known the luxury of letting his guard down, never experienced the simple pleasure of trust without consequence. The knock on his door came precisely at dawn, as it had every morning for the past decade. His captain of the guard, Marcus Ironhold, entered with the day's intelligence reports and a face that revealed nothing of his personal thoughts, exactly as Aldric preferred. "Your Majesty, the southern border remains quiet, but we've received reports of unusual activity in the Thornwood Forest. Travelers have been avoiding the main road, claiming they've seen a lone horse pulling a damaged wagon. Some say it's been wandering the same stretch for 3 days. Aldric looked up from his papers, his steel-grey eyes focusing with the intensity that had made seasoned generals uncomfortable. "And this concerns our security how, Captain?" "It may not, Your Majesty, but the forest borders 3 kingdoms, and abandoned cargo often tells stories about the movements of our neighbors. If someone has been forced to abandon valuable supplies, it might indicate trouble we should be aware of." The Alpha King considered this information while absently rotating the heavy signet ring on his right hand. The ring bore the Ravencrest seal, a black raven with wings spread over a mountain peak, and had been worn by 7 generations of rulers before him. Each of those men had died in battle or from the stress of constant warfare, leaving behind kingdoms that required ever stronger successors to maintain their borders. Aldric had inherited the crown at 12, when his father fell to an assassin's blade during a diplomatic dinner. The boy, who should have been learning to ride horses and read poetry instead, learned to read the intentions behind men's eyes, and to sleep with a dagger under his pillow. By 16, he'd executed 3 attempted coups. By 20, he'd expanded his territory through strategic conquest and marriages of alliance that had never included love or even affection. Now, At 35 he ruled absolutely and without question, but the crown that granted him such power had also isolated him beyond measure. He trusted no one completely, loved no one safely, and faced each day with the constant awareness that today might be the day someone succeeded in taking what he'd fought so hard to protect. "I'll investigate this wagon myself," Aldrich decided, surprising both himself and his captain. Normally, such minor reconnaissance would be delegated to scouts or junior officers. But something about the image of a lone horse struggling through the forest stirred an unusual restlessness in him. Captain Ironhold's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest he ever came to showing surprise. "Your Majesty, surely a patrol would miss details that might prove significant." Aldrich stood, his decision made with the finality that characterized all his choices. "Have my horse prepared. A ride within the hour." As he moved toward his personal armory to select weapons for the journey, Aldrich reflected on the strange impulse that drove his decision. Perhaps it was simply the need to escape the suffocating routine of castle life. Or maybe the warrior in him craved the simplicity of physical investigation over political maneuvering. Whatever the reason, he found himself anticipating the ride through Thornwood Forest with something approaching eagerness, an emotion so foreign to his daily experience that he barely recognized it. The Thornwood Forest stretched before Aldrich like a living cathedral, its ancient oaks and towering pines creating a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. His black destrier, Shadowmere, picked his way carefully along the overgrown path, nostrils flaring at scents that spoke of wilderness and secrets. The Alpha King had ridden these woods as a boy, but that felt like a lifetime ago, before crowns and responsibilities had replaced the simple pleasure of exploration. The sound reached him first, the labored breathing of an exhausted animal and the irregular scraping of wood against stone. As Shadowmere rounded a bend marked by a lightning-struck elm, Aldrich saw the source of the disturbance that had captured his attention. A chestnut mare, ribs visible beneath her dull coat, struggled to pull a wagon that had seen far better days. One wheel sat at an angle that spoke of a broken axle, and the entire contraption lurched with each painful step. Aldrich's first instinct was to approach with the wariness that had kept him alive through 2 decades of rule. Abandoned cargo in border forests often meant bandits, refugees, or worse, spies from neighboring kingdoms testing his defenses. He guided Shadowmere into the shadow of a massive oak and observed the scene with the tactical eye that had served him well in countless battles. The mare was alone, no driver visible on the wagon's bench. Her harness was good quality but worn, suggesting a journey of considerable length. Most telling of all, she moved with the desperate determination of an animal driven by something beyond normal training. Horses abandoned cargo when exhausted. This mare continued pulling despite obvious suffering, which meant something in that wagon was worth protecting. Drawing his sword with the practiced silence of a predator, Aldrich urged Shadowmere forward. The mare noticed his approach and whinnied in distress, but she didn't bolt. Instead, she stopped pulling and stood trembling, as if waiting for judgment. Up close, Aldrich could see the foam around her mouth and the way her legs shook with exhaustion. Whatever had driven her to this point was beyond ordinary desperation. The wagon itself told a story of hasty departure. Supplies scattered in the bed suggested someone had thrown essentials together without time for careful packing. A water barrel had been hastily secured with rope, and blankets lay in a jumbled heap that looked more like a nest than organized cargo. But it was the complete silence from within that made Aldrich's warrior instincts sharpen to a knife's edge. He dismounted and approached the wagon's rear, sword ready for whatever threat might emerge. The canvas covering had been tied shut from the inside, which struck him as odd. Bandits didn't hide in their own wagons, and honest travelers didn't seal themselves away from their drivers. His free hand gripped the canvas tie, and with a swift motion, he yanked it open. What he found inside stopped him as surely as if he'd walked into a stone wall. A woman sat pressed against the far corner of the wagon bed, her arms wrapped protectively around a child who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that might have been beautiful if not for the terror that filled her green eyes. She wore a traveling dress that had once been fine, but now bore the stains and tears of hard living. But it was the way she held the boy, as if her body could shield him from whatever horrors the world might bring, that hit Aldrich with unexpected force. The child was unconscious, his small face pale, with the greyish tinge that spoke of prolonged hunger. His breathing came in shallow pants, and even from a distance Aldrich could see the sharp angles where growing bones showed too clearly beneath skin. The woman's eyes never left Aldrich's face, but he saw the way her gaze flicked to his sword, and calculating distances and possibilities with the desperate mathematics of a cornered animal. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst or crying or both. "Please don't hurt him. He's just a baby. He's done nothing wrong." Aldrich found himself frozen, sword still raised, but suddenly feeling heavier than the crown he'd left behind. In 23 years of rule, he'd seen refugees, prisoners, and supplicants. He'd made decisions about life and death with the cold efficiency that kingship required. But something about this moment, the woman's protective desperation, the child's fragile stillness, the worn cloth doll clutched in small fingers, pierced through defenses he hadn't even known he'd built. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his sword. The woman's eyes widened with surprise, as if kindness was the last thing she'd expected from a man who radiated power and danger. "I won't hurt either of you," Aldrich heard himself say, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "But you need help, both of you." The journey back to Ravencrest Keep passed in a blur of careful decisions and growing concern. Aldrich had lifted the unconscious child from the wagon with surprising gentleness, cradling the boy against his chest, while the woman, who had whispered her name as Eleanor, climbed onto Shadowmere behind him. The mare had been left with provisions and water, too exhausted to travel further, but no longer burdened by the broken wagon. Elena's arms wrapped around Aldrich's waist for balance, and he could feel the tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion and fear. She said nothing during the ride, but her grip tightened whenever the boy stirred, as if she could will him to remain unconscious until they reached safety. The child's fever burned through his clothes, and Aldrich found himself urging Shadowmere to greater speed, despite the woman's precarious position. The guards at Ravencrest Keep had seen their king return from many battles, but never carrying a half-dead child, while a mysterious woman rode behind him. Captain Ironhold met them at the main gate, his weathered face betraying nothing as he helped Elena dismount. Though Aldrich caught the way his captain's eyes assessed the situation with military efficiency. "Send for Healer Merrin immediately," Aldrich commanded, still holding the boy who felt far too light in his arms. "Have her bring everything, fever remedies, strengthening broths, whatever a starving child might need, and prepare the guest chambers in the East Wing." The East Wing had been his mother's quarters before her death 20 years ago. Aldrich rarely entered those rooms, and guests were always housed in the more formal Western chambers. But something about Elena's protective desperation reminded him of the only woman who had ever shown him unconditional love. And the connection made his decision automatic. Within minutes, the royal chambers buzzed with activity. Healer Merrin, a stern woman in her 60s who had served 3 generations of Ravencrest rulers, took one look at the child and began issuing orders with an authority that brooked no argument. Servants appeared with basins of warm water, clean linens, and the precious moonstone that had been mined from the northern mountains, specifically for its healing properties. The moonstone, pale blue and nearly the size of a man's fist, had been set into a silver sconce that could be positioned to direct its ethereal light wherever healing was most needed. Legend claimed the stones drew power from the moon itself, though Aldrich had always been more concerned with their proven ability to accelerate recovery from wounds and illness. As Merrin positioned the stone near the boy's bed, its gentle radiance seemed to bring color back to his pale cheeks. Elena hovered nearby, wanting to help but clearly overwhelmed by the sudden luxury surrounding her. Her eyes darted from the silk bed hangings to the crystal wash basins to the array of medicines Merrin had assembled, as if she couldn't quite believe such comfort existed. When a servant appeared with a steaming bowl of rich broth, Elena's composure finally cracked. "I can't pay for any of this," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "I have nothing left. No coin, no jewelry, nothing to trade. But please don't let that stop you from helping him. I'll work. I'll do anything you ask. But please don't let my son die because I'm worthless." The words hit Aldrich like physical blows. In his world, everything had a price. Every favor carried obligation. Every kindness masked political calculation. But this woman's raw desperation contained no manipulation, no hidden agenda, only a mother's pure terror at her child's suffering. "You owe me nothing," Aldrich said quietly, moving to stand beside the bed where Merrin was coaxing spoonfuls of broth between the boy's lips. "This is what we do for guests under our protection." Elena stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "But you're the Alpha King. Everyone knows the stories. You don't show mercy to strangers." The reputation that had served him so well in maintaining order suddenly felt like a cage. Every story of his ruthlessness, every tale of swift justice and unforgiving rule, had created an image that left no room for the simple human impulse to help someone in need. "The stories aren't wrong," Aldrich admitted, watching as the boy's breathing grew steadier under Merrin's care. "But they aren't complete either. A king who cannot protect the innocent is no king at all." Over the next several hours, the chambers transformed into a hub of healing activity. The boy, Marcus, Elena had finally revealed, began responding to treatment with the resilience of youth. His fever broke near midnight, and he managed to keep down several spoonfuls of broth before falling into natural sleep rather than the troubling unconsciousness that had frightened them all. Elena herself proved almost as much a patient as her son. When Merrin finished with Marcus, she turned her attention to the woman who had clearly been sacrificing her own needs to keep the child alive. A hot bath, clean clothes, and a proper meal revealed someone far younger than her haggard appearance had suggested, perhaps only 25, with the kind of natural grace that spoke of gentle upbringing despite her current circumstances. 3 days after their arrival, Aldrich found himself doing something unprecedented, setting aside his personal battle sword before entering the guest chambers. The weapon had been forged by the finest smiths in the Northern Territories, its blade inscribed with runes that had seen him through countless battles. But something about Elena's nervous glances at his weapons made him realize that symbols of violence, however practical for a king, might not be appropriate for someone still recovering from whatever trauma had driven her to that wagon. He knocked softly before entering, a courtesy he rarely extended to anyone. Elena sat beside Marcus's bed, reading to him from a book of children's tales that Merrin had found in the castle's library. The sight stopped Aldrich short, not because it was unusual to see a mother reading to her child, but because he couldn't remember anyone ever reading to him with such gentle attention. Marcus looked transformed from the pale, unconscious boy they'd found 3 days ago. Color had returned to his cheeks, and his eyes sparkled with the curiosity natural to children his age. When he saw Aldrich in the doorway, instead of fear, his face lit up with the kind of pure delight that the Alpha King hadn't realized still existed in the world. "Your Majesty." Marcus scrambled to sit up straighter, though his mother's gentle hand kept him from leaving the bed entirely. "Mama was reading about knights and dragons." "Are you really a knight? Do you fight dragons?" Elena's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Marcus, you mustn't bother His Majesty with so many questions. I'm sure he has important matters to attend to." But Aldrich found himself moving closer to the bed, genuinely curious about the boy's eager interest. "What kind of dragons are you reading about, Marcus?" The question unleashed a torrent of 6-year-old enthusiasm. Marcus launched into a detailed description of the story's dragon, complete with gestures that made Elena smile despite her obvious nervousness. As the boy spoke, Aldrich noticed the way Elena's entire being seemed to soften when she looked at her son, as if all the fear and wariness she carried melted away in the face of his innocent joy. "The dragon in the story isn't really bad," Marcus explained seriously. "He's just lonely and scared because everyone runs away when they see him." "Do you think real dragons might be lonely too?" The question caught Aldrich off guard. In his experience, dragons, like enemies and political rivals, were problems to be solved with strength and strategy. The idea that something powerful might also be lonely was a perspective he'd never considered. "Perhaps they are," Aldrich replied slowly, settling into the chair beside Elena. "Sometimes being strong and feared can be very isolating." Elena glanced at him sharply, as if she'd heard something in his voice that surprised her. Their eyes met for a moment, and Aldrich saw intelligence there, along with the wariness he'd come to expect. Whatever her circumstances, this woman was not simple or naive. "Marcus," Elena said gently, "why don't you rest for a while? All this talking might tire you out." The boy protested briefly, but was clearly still recovering his strength. Within minutes, he'd curled up with the worn cloth doll that never left his side, and drifted into the kind of peaceful sleep that only children seemed capable of achieving. "He's never had a real bed before," Elena said quietly, smoothing the covers around her son, "or enough food or anyone to read him stories except me when I could manage it. Seeing him like this, safe and comfortable, I keep waiting to wake up and find it was all a dream." "Where did you come from?" Aldrich asked, keeping his voice gentle, despite his growing curiosity about her circumstances. "The nearest settlement is 2 days' ride from where I found you." "And you were traveling away from it, not toward it." Elena's hand stilled on the blanket, and he saw the careful consideration that preceded her answer. "We've been traveling for a long time. Sometimes it's hard to remember exactly where we started or what direction we're heading." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Aldrich recognized the diplomatic evasion. He'd used similar techniques countless times in political negotiations. The realization that Elena was skilled in such subtleties only deepened his curiosity about her background. "You're educated," he observed. "Your speech, your manners, the way you read to Marcus, you weren't born to poverty." Fear flickered across Elena's features before she composed herself. "Many people find themselves in circumstances they never expected, Your Majesty. Sometimes life takes everything away, no matter how it started." "True enough," Aldrich agreed, remembering his own childhood's abrupt transformation from protected prince to embattled king. "But you're safe here, Elena. Whatever drove you to that wagon, whatever you're running from, it can't reach you within these walls. Can you promise that?" The question escaped her before she could stop it, revealing depths of fear that her careful composure usually hid. "I am the Alpha King," Aldrich replied simply. "My promises are absolute." By the end of their first week at Ravencrest Keep, Elena had fallen into a routine that felt dangerously close to contentment. She woke each morning to sunlight streaming through windows that faced east toward gardens, instead of west toward whatever dangers might be pursuing them. Marcus grew stronger daily, his laughter echoing through chambers that had known too little joy for far too long. It was during one of these peaceful mornings that Aldrich discovered something that shook his carefully maintained emotional distance. He'd come to check on Marcus's progress and found the boy still sleeping, while Elena sat by the window, carefully mending a small tear in her son's shirt. The morning light caught something at her throat, a flash of silver that she quickly tucked back beneath her dress when she noticed his attention. "It's nothing valuable," Eleanor said hastily, her hand moving protectively to cover whatever she'd hidden. "Just a trinket I managed to keep," but Aldrich had glimpsed enough to recognize quality workmanship, possibly even royal craftsmanship. The chain had been delicate silver, and what little he'd seen of the pendant suggested intricate engraving work that required master jewelers to execute. Such pieces weren't trinkets, they were heirlooms, Gifts from people of significant wealth and status. He chose not to press the matter, filing the information away with growing certainty that Elena's story contained layers she wasn't ready to reveal. Instead, he found himself watching her interactions with Marcus, studying the profound devotion that shaped every aspect of her behavior. When Marcus scraped his knee during an enthusiastic exploration of the chamber's furniture, Elena's response revealed the kind of maternal love that Aldrich had only heard described in songs and stories. She gathered the boy against her with infinite gentleness, murmuring reassurances while examining the minor injury with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a mother's attention could heal wounds beyond the merely physical. "There now, little knight," she whispered, kissing the top of Marcus's head. "Just a small battle scar to prove how brave you are, like the one the king has," Marcus asked, pointing toward his own temple in imitation of Aldrich's facial scar. "Exactly like that," Eleanor agreed, though her eyes met Aldrich's with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sometimes the marks we carry remind us of how strong we really are." Watching this gentle healing, Aldrich found himself remembering his own childhood injuries and the way they'd been treated as lessons in endurance rather than opportunities for comfort. His father had believed that coddling children made them weak, that a future king needed to learn early that pain was simply another challenge to overcome through willpower. But Marcus's complete trust in his mother's ability to make everything better, and Elena's patient attention to both his physical hurt and emotional needs, suggested a different kind of strength. This was nurturing that built confidence rather than fear, love that created security rather than anxiety. "He's fortunate to have you," Aldrich said quietly after Marcus had been distracted by a new toy that Merrin had brought. Elena's smile carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "He's all I have left in the world. Everything I do, every choice I make, it's all for him. I die before I let anything hurt that child." The fierce protectiveness in her voice resonated with something deep in Aldrich's chest. He'd spent 23 years protecting a kingdom, making decisions that affected thousands of lives. But he'd never experienced the kind of personal, absolute devotion that Elena described. "He knows that," Aldrich observed. "It's written in the way he looks at you, the confidence he has that you'll always be there for him. Will I, though?" The question seemed to escape Elena before she could stop it. "I've been running for so long, making promises I might not be able to keep. What if someday I can't protect him? What if my best efforts aren't enough?" The vulnerability in her admission struck Aldrich with unexpected force. Here was someone else who carried the weight of responsibility for another's well-being, someone who understood the crushing fear that came with having someone's entire world depend on your decisions. "You've kept him alive and brought him to safety," Aldrich replied. "That's not the work of someone who gives up easily." Elena turned to look at him fully, perhaps hearing something in his voice that made her reassess the man behind the fearsome reputation. "Do you ever wonder if you're strong enough? If the choices you make will turn out to be right?" "Every day," Aldrich admitted, the honesty surprising him. "Every decision affects lives I'm responsible for protecting. The crown comes with the constant knowledge that failure means more than personal consequences." For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, two people who understood the burden of protecting others, discovering an unexpected kinship. Outside, the castle bustled with its daily activities. But within this chamber, something new was taking root, a connection neither had anticipated when Aldrich first opened that wagon in Thornwood Forest. The castle's moonlit garden had always been Aldrich's sanctuary during sleepless nights, but he'd never shared it with anyone until the evening he found Elena wandering the corridors, unable to rest despite her obvious exhaustion. Something about her restless energy called to his own inability to find peace, and without conscious decision, he'd invited her to walk with him among the white roses that bloomed only in darkness. The roses had been his mother's creation, a variety bred specifically to open their petals under moonlight and release their fragrance into the cool night air. Queen Isabella had died when Aldrich was 15, but her garden remained exactly as she'd designed it, a place where beauty existed for its own sake rather than to serve political purposes or display royal wealth. "They're extraordinary," Elena breathed, touching one of the luminous blooms with reverent fingers. "I've never seen roses that bloomed at night. How is it possible?" "My mother spent years working with the royal botanists to develop them," Aldrich replied, surprised by how easily he shared the memory. "She said that too much beauty in the world existed only during daylight hours, and that those who suffered from sleepless nights deserved something lovely to comfort them." Elena glanced at him with new understanding. "She sounds like a wise woman, and kind. She was the only person who ever loved me without condition," Aldrich admitted, the words emerging from some deep place he rarely accessed. "Everyone else's affection depends on my usefulness to them, my ability to provide protection or advantage. But she loved me simply because I existed." They walked in comfortable silence between the garden's carefully tended paths, the white roses creating pools of ethereal beauty in the darkness. Elena's presence beside him felt natural in a way that startled Aldrich with its unfamiliarity. For 20 years, he'd walked these paths alone, carrying the weight of his responsibilities without anyone to share the burden. "Marcus asks about his father sometimes," Elena said quietly, settling onto a stone bench carved with his mother's favorite quote about love being the only force strong enough to transform hearts. "I tell him stories about a brave man who loved us both very much but had to go away. Someday I'll have to explain that going away was actually dying, but for now the stories comfort him." "How did he die?" Aldrich asked gently, settling beside her on the bench. Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap, and he saw her struggle with how much truth to reveal. "Violence," she said finally. "Sudden, senseless violence that destroyed everything I thought I understood about the world. One day we were a family planning our future together, and the next day I was alone with a baby, running for our lives." The pain in her voice was raw enough that Aldrich found himself wanting to comfort her, an impulse so foreign to his usual interactions that he barely recognized it. In his world, people brought him their problems to solve, not their grief to share. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "Losing someone you love changes everything about how you see the world." "Yes," Elena agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It does. But finding unexpected kindness." She turned to look at him directly, her green eyes reflecting moonlight and something deeper. "That changes things too. You've given us safety when we had nowhere else to turn. You've been gentle with Marcus when you had no reason to care about a stranger's child." "Why?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Aldrich found himself studying Elena's face in the moonlight, noting the way worry had carved fine lines around her eyes but hadn't diminished the warmth that seemed to emanate from her very being. "Perhaps because I recognize something in both of you," he replied slowly. "The determination to survive despite impossible circumstances. The love that makes someone willing to sacrifice everything for another person's well-being. I've spent so long focused on duty and strength that I'd forgotten those qualities existed." "You're not what I expected when I heard the stories about the Alpha King," Elena confessed. "The tales make you sound like a monster incapable of mercy or gentleness." "The monster keeps my kingdom safe," Aldrich replied. "But monsters are lonely creatures, Elena. They inspire fear and respect, but never this." He gestured between them, struggling to name what was developing in the space their conversations had created. "What is this?" Elena asked, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and wariness. Aldrich considered the question seriously, recognizing that his answer would change something fundamental between them. "I think it's the beginning of caring about someone's happiness more than my own convenience. I think it's discovering that protecting you and Marcus feels more important than maintaining my reputation for heartless efficiency." Eleanor's breath caught audibly, and for a moment the garden held only the sound of night birds and the whisper of wind through rose petals. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of equal honesty. I think it's learning to trust again, when I swore I never would. I think it's seeing kindness in someone the world calls ruthless, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, home isn't a place, but a person. The messenger arrived at dawn on the 10th day of Elena's stay, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding through the night. Captain Ironhold intercepted him at the gates, but the man's urgent whispers and the blood-stained royal signet ring he carried as proof of his message's authenticity brought him quickly to Uldric's private. "Study, your majesty," the messenger gasped, still breathing hard from his desperate ride. "King Morteus of Shadowmere sends urgent word. He seeks information about a woman and child who may have passed through your territory. He offers substantial reward for any knowledge of their whereabouts." Uldric's blood turned to ice as he examined the ring the messenger had produced as proof of his credentials. The heavy gold bore the seal of Shadowmere, a kingdom to the east known for its harsh rule and crueler king. King Morteus had a reputation that made even Uldric's fearsome image seem gentle by comparison. A man who ruled through terror and took pleasure in others' pain. "Describe this woman and child," Uldric commanded, though he already feared what the answer would be. "Dark hair, green eyes, traveling with a boy of perhaps 6 years. She goes by Elena, though that may not be her true name. King Morteus says she is precious to him, and he grows impatient with her absence." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the threat underlying the message. Uldric had heard enough about Morteus to understand that precious in his vocabulary meant possession, and his impatience would manifest in violence against anyone who kept him from reclaiming what he considered his. "What makes King Morteus think this woman would be in my territory?" Uldric asked, maintaining the neutral tone that revealed nothing of his racing thoughts. "She was seen traveling west from the Thornwood borderlands. Morteus has sent riders to every kingdom within a week's travel, offering gold for information and—" the messenger hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the next part of his message, "and promising unpleasant consequences for anyone found to be harboring her." Uldric dismissed the messenger with instructions to rest and water his horse, claiming he needed time to consider whether his people had encountered the woman described. But as soon as the man left his study, Uldric found himself pacing like a caged wolf, his mind racing through possibilities and threats. The political implications alone were staggering. King Morteus commanded a substantial army and had never hesitated to use military force to achieve his goals. If he discovered that Elena was under Uldric's protection, it could mean war between their kingdoms. A war that would cost thousands of lives and drain resources Uldric needed for defending against other threats. But the personal implications cut even deeper. In just 10 days, Elena and Marcus had become more than guests in his castle. They'd awakened parts of himself he'd thought were buried forever beneath the necessities of kingship. The idea of surrendering them to a man known for his cruelty felt like tearing away pieces of his own soul. The worst part was Elena's obvious terror whenever she thought she heard unfamiliar voices in the corridors. Her constant vigilance, the way she positioned herself between Marcus and any potential threat, the nightmares that sometimes woke her in the small hours. All of it suggested she was running from someone who had already caused her profound trauma. Uldric made his way to the East Wing chambers, needing to see Elena and Marcus before deciding how to respond to Morteus's message. He found them in their usual morning routine, Elena reading, while Marcus played with wooden blocks that the castle's carpenter had crafted for him. The scene of domestic tranquility felt like a mockery of the danger closing in around them. "Elena," Uldric said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately." Something in his tone must have alarmed her, because her face went pale and her hand moved instinctively to that silver chain at her throat. "Marcus, sweetheart, why don't you take your blocks into the other room? I need to talk to His Majesty for a moment." When they were alone, Elena turned to face him with the kind of desperate composure he'd seen on battlefields, the look of someone preparing for the worst possible news. "Someone," is looking for you," Aldrich said without preamble. "King Mortius of Shadowmere has sent messengers to every neighboring kingdom, offering rewards for information about a woman and child matching your description." Elena's knees buckled, and only Aldrich's quick reflexes kept her from collapsing entirely. He guided her to a chair, noting how her entire body trembled with a terror that went far beyond simple fear. "He found us," she whispered, her voice breaking. I hoped we'd traveled far enough, hidden well enough." "But he found us, Eleanor," Aldrich said gently, kneeling beside her chair. "Who is King Mortius to you? What does he want?" Her green eyes met his, filled with a despair so profound it made his chest ache. "He wants to marry me, Aldrich, and he'll kill anyone who stands in his way." The decision to craft Marcus's first sword came to Aldrich during one of their evening walks through the castle grounds. The boy had been asking endless questions about knights and battles, his imagination fired by the stories Elena read to him each night. But more than childish curiosity drove Aldrich's choice to spend hours in the castle's forge, working alongside the master weaponsmith to create something perfectly sized for small hands. The wooden practice sword emerged from careful selection of ashwood, known for its strength and flexibility. Aldrich personally shaped the grip to fit Marcus's fingers, carved simple protective runes along the blade, and wrapped the handle with soft leather that wouldn't blister young palms. As he worked, he found himself remembering his own first weapon, a gift from his father that had come with lectures about duty and responsibility rather than joy and encouragement. "What are you making?" Marcus asked, appearing in the armory doorway with the fearless curiosity that seemed to define his approach to the world. "Something for a young knight who's been asking too many questions about swordplay," Aldrich replied, testing the weapon's balance one final time before presenting it to the boy. Marcus's eyes went wide with wonder as he accepted the sword, his small hands wrapping around the grip with instinctive care. "It's really for me, my own sword. The knight needs proper equipment," Aldrich said solemnly, though he couldn't suppress the smile that tugged at his lips. "But a sword comes with responsibilities, Marcus. You must promise to use it only to protect those who cannot protect themselves." "I promise," Marcus said, with the intense seriousness that children brought to important moments. "Mama says protecting people is the most important job anyone can have." The words hit Aldrich with unexpected force, reminding him that Elena had been teaching her son the same values that had guided his own life, albeit through gentleness rather than harsh necessity. This child was learning about honor and protection through love rather than fear, and the difference showed in his eager enthusiasm rather than grim determination. Their practice sessions became a daily ritual that transformed not just Marcus's confidence but Aldrich's understanding of what it meant to nurture potential rather than simply demand performance. Each afternoon, they worked together in the castle's training yard, with Aldrich teaching basic stances and movements while Elena watched from the sidelines, her face glowing with pride and something deeper, gratitude for the man who had chosen to invest time and attention in her son's development. "Keep your elbow up," Aldrich instructed gently, adjusting Marcus's grip with the patience of someone who had discovered the profound satisfaction of watching a child master new skills. "A sword is an extension of your arm, not a separate tool. Feel how it moves with you." Marcus's face scrunched in concentration as he attempted the movements Aldrich demonstrated, his determination evident in every carefully controlled swing. When he finally managed a complete sequence without dropping his guard, his whoop of triumph echoed across the training yard with infectious joy. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see how I did that whole thing without messing up?" Elena's applause carried the kind of maternal pride that made Aldrich's chest tighten with emotions he couldn't name. Watching her celebrate Marcus's small victories, seeing the way her love created a foundation of confidence that let the boy attempt challenging tasks without fear of failure, showed him possibilities he'd never imagined. "You're a natural teacher," Elena told him one evening, after Marcus had finally exhausted himself practicing and been carried off to bed. "He adores you, Aldrich. He talks about nothing but your training sessions and how someday he's going to be a knight just like you." "He's going to be better than me," Aldrich replied, meaning it completely. "He's learning about strength and honor from a foundation of love and security. That creates a different kind of warrior, one who fights to protect rather than simply to win." They stood together in the training yard as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, surrounded by the comfortable silence that had become natural between them. The wooden sword lay forgotten on a nearby bench, but its significance lingered in the air, a symbol of trust, of investment in the future, of the family bonds that were forming despite the circumstances that had brought them together. "I never expected this," Elena said softly, her voice carrying wonder and fear in equal measure. "When I was running through those woods with Marcus, desperate and terrified, I never imagined we'd find not just safety but this." "What is this?" Aldrich asked, echoing the question she'd posed in the moonlit garden, but understanding now that the answer had evolved far beyond their initial tentative connection. "Home," Eleanor whispered. "For the first time since Marcus's father died, this feels like home, and that terrifies me more than all the running and hiding ever did." "Why?" Aldrich asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Because home means having something to lose again, and Mortius is still out there, still looking, still determined to claim what he thinks belongs to him." The nightmare came on their 15th night at Ravencrest Keep, tearing Elena from sleep with such violence that her screams echoed through the stone corridors. Aldrich reached her chambers before the guards, finding her sitting bolt upright in bed, her face pale with terror, and her hands shaking as if she were still trapped in whatever horror had visited her dreams. "Elena," he said gently, moving slowly to avoid startling her further. "You're safe. You're in my castle, in your chambers. Whatever you saw, it wasn't real." But her wild eyes seemed to look through him to some distant threat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the flat tone of someone reliving trauma rather than recounting a dream. "The blood on his hands," she whispered. "There's always so much blood on his hands, and he never washes it off. He wants me to see it, wants me to know what he's capable of when people displease him." Aldrich's jaw clenched as he began to understand the depth of Elena's terror. This wasn't simple fear of an unwanted marriage. This was the bone-deep horror of someone who had witnessed King Mortius's cruelty firsthand. "Tell me," Aldrich said quietly, settling into the chair beside her bed. "Tell me what he did to you." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, and for the first time she pulled out the silver locket she'd kept hidden since their arrival. The chain was indeed exquisite workmanship, but it was the pendant itself that made Aldrich's breath catch. Even in the dim candlelight, he could see it was no simple jewelry. The locket bore the royal seal of Valdris, a neighboring kingdom that had fallen to Shadowmere's forces 3 years ago. "My name isn't just Elena," she said, her voice steadying as she made the decision to trust him with the truth. "It's Elena Valdris, Princess Elena Valdris, the last surviving member of the royal family that Mortius destroyed when he conquered my kingdom." The words hit Aldrich like physical blows, recontextualizing everything he thought he knew about Elena's circumstances. She wasn't simply a woman fleeing an unwanted marriage. She was a fugitive princess whose very existence threatened Mortius's claim to legitimacy in Valdris. "Marcus," Aldrich said, understanding flooding through him. "He's not just your son, he's the heir to Valdris." Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face as she opened the locket to reveal a miniature portrait of a man with Marcus's eyes and gentle smile. His father was Prince Darian of Eldermere. "We were married in secret, planning to announce our union and secure alliances that would protect Valdris from Shadowmere's expansion. But Mortius moved faster than we anticipated. The torn royal decree fell from the locket as Elena's hands shook, and Aldrich recognized the formal language of a betrothal contract. But this document had been ripped deliberately, the jagged edges speaking of desperate resistance rather than ceremonial cancellation. "Mortius killed your family," Aldrich said, the pieces of her story falling into place with horrifying clarity. "He killed everyone," Elena confirmed, her voice breaking. "My parents, my brothers, even the servants who tried to protect us. But he kept me alive because he decided that marrying the Valdris princess would legitimize his conquest better than simply claiming the throne by force." "And Darian? Executed publicly, along with anyone who might have supported our marriage or Marcus's claim to any throne. Mortius made me watch, made me understand that resistance would only bring more death to people I cared about." Aldrich felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold fury that had served him well in battle, but rarely emerged in personal matters. The idea of forcing someone to witness their loved one's execution as a form of control was exactly the kind of calculated cruelty that had earned Mortius his reputation. "How did you escape?" "A servant girl who looked enough like me to fool distant observers. She volunteered to take my place, knowing it meant her death, so that Marcus and I could flee during the chaos of what everyone thought was my wedding preparation." Eleanor's voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that had clearly haunted her for years. "She died so we could live, and I've been running ever since, trying to keep Marcus safe while Mortius sends hunters after the prize that escaped him." The wooden sword Aldrich had made for Marcus lay on the table beside Elena's bed, its innocent craftsmanship taking on new significance in light of these revelations. He wasn't just teaching a boy to play at being a knight. He was training the rightful heir to a conquered kingdom, a child whose very existence posed a threat to one of the most dangerous rulers in the known world. "Elena," Aldrich said carefully, "Mortius will never stop hunting you. As long as you and Marcus live, you represent a challenge to his authority in Valdris. This isn't about marriage anymore. It's about eliminating the last obstacles to his complete control." "I know," Elena whispered. "I've always known. But what else could I do? Let him kill my son to secure his stolen throne? Watch him turn Marcus into another victim of his ambition?" "No," Aldrich said firmly, "but you can't run forever. And now that his hunters have traced you this far, running may no longer be an option." The discovery came 3 days after Elena's devastating confession, when Aldrich was researching historical treatises in his private library. Buried among diplomatic correspondence from his father's reign, he found the document that changed everything, a blood-packed scroll bearing both the Ravencrest and Shadowmere seals. Written in the formal language of political alliance, the parchment was yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, its words carrying the weight of binding law across kingdoms. As Aldrich read the carefully scripted terms, his blood turned to ice. 25 years ago, his father had signed an agreement with Mortius's predecessor, promising that any future union between the royal houses would cement permanent peace between their territories. But it was the specific clause buried in the legal language that made Aldrich's hands shake with fury. The treaty explicitly promised Princess Elena Valdris as bride to the heir of Shadowmere, signed when she was barely 5 years old, and sealed with drops of blood from both kingdoms' rulers. Elena hadn't simply fled an unwanted marriage. She was bound by ancient law to a man who now held legal claim to her hand. Worse still, the pact contained provisions for enforcement that made Aldrich's stomach churn. If the promised bride proved reluctant, neighboring kingdoms were bound by treaty to assist in her return, under threat of being declared enemies of both signatory nations. Elena's presence in his castle didn't just risk war with Shadowmere. It potentially violated sacred treaties that formed the foundation of international law. "Your Majesty!" Captain Ironhold's voice interrupted Aldrich's horrified examination of the document. "King Mortius has arrived at our borders with a full military escort." He requests immediate audience regarding the return of his lawful bride. The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of consequence through every possible future Aldrich could imagine. Morteus wasn't simply searching anymore. He'd found them, and he'd brought enough force to ensure compliance with his demands. How many men? Aldrich asked, though he already suspected the answer would complicate his options further. 300 heavy cavalry, Your Majesty. Full battle gear and siege equipment. He's not planning to take refusal gracefully. Aldrich looked down at the blood pact in his hands, understanding now why Elena had seemed so hopeless when she'd finally revealed her identity. This wasn't a matter of personal choice or even political preference. Ancient law, backed by the threat of overwhelming force, had trapped her in circumstances that offered no honorable escape. Send word that I'll meet with King Morteus in the Great Hall within the hour, Aldrich commanded. Full formal protocol, but double the guards. And Captain, make sure Princess Elena and her son remain in the East Wing under heavy protection. Princess. Ironhold's eyebrows rose with surprise, though his military training kept his voice neutral. Princess Eleanor Valdris, last heir to the conquered kingdom, and apparently my guest's true identity. King Morteus has legal claim to her hand through treaties signed before either of us was born. Ironhold's weathered face showed the same grim understanding that had settled over Aldrich. Military men recognized impossible situations when they saw them, and this scenario offered no clean solutions. As Aldrich prepared for the confrontation that would determine Elena and Marcus's fate, he found himself thinking about the wooden sword he'd crafted for the boy, the gentle evenings reading by candlelight, the way Elena's laughter had begun to echo through corridors that had known too little joy. 3 weeks ago his life had been predictable, lonely but manageable, purposeful but cold. Now the thought of surrendering the family he'd unexpectedly found felt like tearing away pieces of his soul. But the blood-packed scroll in his hands represented more than personal disappointment. Breaking ancient treaties could mean war, not just with Shadowmere, but with any kingdom that honored the old agreements. Thousands of his people could die to protect one woman and child, no matter how much they'd come to mean to him personally. Elena appeared in his study doorway, her face pale but composed. He's here, isn't he? I can see the smoke from his campfires from my window. Elena, Aldrich began, but she held up a hand to stop him. I know what that scroll says, she said quietly, nodding toward the document on his desk. I've always known about the blood pact. My parents told me when I was old enough to understand why they were so desperate to arrange my marriage to Darian before Morteus could claim me. Then you know I'm bound by law to return you to him. Yes, Elena replied, her voice steady, despite the tears that threatened to spill from her green eyes. And I know you're honorable enough to follow the law, even when it costs you everything you've come to care about. Elena. No, Aldrich. Don't make this harder than it already is. I've had 3 weeks of happiness, 3 weeks of feeling safe and loved and protected. That's more than I dared hope for when I was hiding in that wagon. Don't let your feelings for me destroy the kingdom you've spent your life building. What about Marcus? Elena's composure finally cracked, and Aldrich saw the terrified mother beneath the resigned princess. Promise me you'll find a way to protect him. He's innocent in all of this. Whatever happens to me, please don't let Morteus use my son as a weapon against the people of Valdris. King Morteus entered Ravencrest Keep's great hall like a storm front, his presence filling the space with an aura of barely contained violence. He was a man built for intimidation, tall and broad-shouldered, with black hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue weaknesses in everyone they surveyed. But it was the black iron gauntlets he wore that made even Aldrich's seasoned guards shift uncomfortably at their posts. The gauntlets were Morteus's signature, forged from metal taken from the crown jewels of kingdoms he'd conquered. Each finger bore intricate engravings that depicted scenes of subjugation and surrender, while the knuckles were adorned with gems pried from the royal regalia of fallen dynasties. They weren't simply armor, they were trophies that announced their wearer's capacity for destruction. Aldrich Ravencrest, Mortius said, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that came from never being refused. You look well. Kingship suits you, though I hear you've been playing host to some rather interesting guests recently. King Mortius, Aldrich replied with the formal courtesy required between rulers, though every instinct screamed at him to reach for his sword. Welcome to Ravencrest Keep. I trust your journey was pleasant. Pleasant enough, though it would have been unnecessary if certain individuals had remained where they belonged. Mortius removed his gauntlets with deliberate slowness, the gesture revealing hands marked with old scars that spoke of violence personally delivered rather than merely commanded. I believe you have something that belongs to me. I have many things in my castle. Perhaps you could be more specific. Mortius's laugh held no warmth, only the kind of amusement predators showed when toying with cornered prey. Princess Elena Valdris and her bastard son. They've been missing from my kingdom for nearly 4 years, and my patience with their absence has reached its limit. The casual cruelty with which Mortius referred to Marcus made Aldrich's jaw clench with suppressed fury. That he would call an innocent child a bastard simply to diminish his worth revealed the depths of his character. The woman and child under my protection are guests, not prisoners, Aldrich replied carefully. If they are indeed the people you seek, any discussion of their future would need to include their own wishes. Their wishes? Mortius's eyebrows rose with mock surprise. How wonderfully progressive of you, Aldrich. But I'm afraid personal preferences don't override legal obligations. The blood pact between our kingdoms makes Princess Elena my lawful bride, regardless of her reluctance. Even if such a treaty exists, forced marriage violates the basic principles of what? Modern sentiment? Mortius interrupted, his voice hardening. The blood pact was signed in accordance with laws that predate both our reigns. More importantly, it was sealed with the understanding that violation would be considered an act of war. The threat hung in the air between them, as real and sharp as the weapons both men carried. Aldrich had known this confrontation would come to ultimatums, but hearing them spoken aloud made the stakes impossible to ignore. You would wage war over one woman. You would wage war to prevent the precedent that ancient treaties can be broken whenever convenient, Mortius replied. Elena is mine by right of law, conquest, and blood. Her son represents a potential future challenge to my authority in Valdris. Both will return with me, willingly or otherwise. And if I refuse? Mortius smiled, the expression making his scarred features look genuinely predatory. Then you'll discover why 5 kingdoms have fallen to my forces in the past decade. Your people seem prosperous and content, Aldrich. It would be such a shame to see Ravencrest keeps towers reduced to rubble because you developed an unfortunate attachment to another man's property. Elena is not property. Elena is whatever I say she is. Just as this conversation ends, however, I decide it should end. Mortius gestured toward the great hall's windows, through which the smoke from his military camp was clearly visible. I brought 300 men as an honor guard, but twice that number waits a day's ride from your borders. Refuse my reasonable request, and they become a besieging army. Aldrich felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. Everything Mortius said was true. The blood pact gave him legal claim to Elena. His military superiority made resistance potentially suicidal, and ancient laws supported his position regardless of personal feelings. I need time to consider your proposal. You have until sunset, Mortius replied, pulling his gauntlets back on with the same deliberate menace he'd shown in removing them. Present the princess and her son at my camp before the sun disappears, or face the consequences of harboring stolen property. And if they refuse to go willingly? Mortius's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp for human comfort. Willingness is optional, Aldrich. Compliance is not. Elena learned that lesson once before, though apparently she needs refreshing on the subject. The implication hit Aldrich like a physical blow. confirming his worst suspicions about how Mortius had originally gained Elena's submission. The man hadn't simply conquered her kingdom, he'd broken her spirit through methods that violated every principle of honorable warfare. The ancient war horn of Ravencrest Keep had not been sounded in 15 years, not since the last major threat to the Northern Territories had been repelled through diplomatic rather than military means. Forged from brass taken from the first dragon slain in these lands, the horn's voice could carry across 3 valleys and summon every sworn ally within a day's hard ride. But as Aldrich stood in his private armory, weighing the massive instrument in his hands, he understood that blowing it would mean accepting consequences that could reshape the political landscape for generations. 300 of his own men waited in the castle's courtyards, ready to fight if their king commanded it. But Mortius's forces outnumbered them significantly, and the reinforcements he'd mentioned could arrive within days. Even if Aldrich could win such a battle, the cost in lives would be staggering, and Elena would blame herself for every death that resulted from protecting her and Marcus. "Your Majesty?" Captain Ironhold entered the armory with the measured steps of a man who had served through enough crises to recognize when his king faced impossible decisions. "The princess is asking to speak with you. She says it's urgent." Aldrich set the war horn aside, understanding that whatever Eleanor had to say might influence whether that ancient brass would sing its call to battle. He found her in the East Wing chambers, pacing with the restless energy of someone who had made a terrible decision and was gathering courage to announce it. Marcus sat on his bed, clutching the wooden sword Aldrich had made for him, and watching his mother with the kind of worried confusion that broke hearts. The boy was old enough to sense the adult tension surrounding him, but too young to understand the forces that threatened to tear apart the only security he'd ever known. "Elena," Aldrich said gently, noting the way her hands shook despite her obvious effort to appear calm. "What did you want to tell me?" "I'm going to him," she announced, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who had exhausted all other options. "Tonight before sunset? I'll take Marcus and present myself at Mortius's camp, exactly as he demanded." "No." The word escaped Aldrich with such force that both Elena and Marcus startled. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself to protect my kingdom. It's not your choice to make," Elena replied, though tears threatened to undermine her composed facade. "I'm not your subject, Aldrich. I'm a fugitive princess whose presence here threatens everything you've built. The responsible thing, the only thing that makes sense, is for me to accept the inevitable. The inevitable. Elena, you know what he'll do to you." "Yes, I know exactly what he'll do. But I also know what he'll do to your people if I stay hidden behind your protection. Mortius doesn't make empty threats, and he's perfectly capable of besieging this castle until every person inside starves or surrenders." Marcus looked between them with growing alarm, his 6-year-old mind struggling to process why the adults he trusted were talking about such frightening possibilities. "Mama, are we leaving?" "I don't want to leave. I like it here with the king." Eleanor's composure cracked as she knelt beside her son, gathering him into her arms with the desperate intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail of the moment. "Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do, sweetheart. Sometimes protecting the people we love means making hard choices. But the king will protect us," Marcus protested, looking at Aldrich with the absolute faith that children reserve for their heroes. "He's the strongest knight in the whole kingdom. He can fight the bad men and make them go away." The trust in Marcus's voice hit Aldrich harder than any threat Mortius could make. This child believed in him completely, expected him to solve problems that had no clean solutions, and would carry the memory of today's outcome for the rest of his life. "Marcus is right," Aldrich said quietly, his decision crystallizing as he spoke. "I can fight them. The question is whether the cost of fighting is worth paying." "The cost?" Elena stood, placing herself between Aldrich and her son, as if she could physically shield Marcus from the consequences of adult choices. The cost is hundreds of lives lost in a war that accomplishes nothing except delaying what must eventually happen anyway. Mortius will never stop hunting us, Aldrich. Even if you win this battle, he'll return with more men, more allies, more determination to claim what the law says belongs to him. Then we change the law. You can't change ancient treaties by force of arms. Blood pacts aren't nullified by battlefield victories. They're honored or broken, with all the political consequences that follow. Aldrich moved to the window, looking out at the smoke rising from Mortius's camp and the war horn he'd left in his armory. For 23 years, he'd made difficult decisions by weighing costs against benefits, calculating risks against potential gains. But this choice defied such cold analysis because it involved people he'd come to love more than his own life. There might be another way, he said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or suicidal. Mortius claims legal right to you through conquest and ancient treaty. But what if someone had a stronger legal claim? Elena's mother's wedding ring had traveled with her through 4 years of desperate flight, hidden in a secret pocket sewn into her traveling dress. The simple gold band, worn smooth by decades of faithful marriage, was the last physical connection to the family Mortius had destroyed. As Elena pressed it into Aldrich's palm in the moments before he departed to challenge the Shadowmere King, the gesture carried more weight than any formal declaration of love could have achieved. "This was my mother's promise to my father," Elena whispered, her fingers closing Aldrich's hand around the precious circle of gold. She wore it through 40 years of marriage, through wars and peace, through joy and sorrow. It represents the kind of love that endures beyond death, beyond separation, beyond all the forces that try to tear people apart. "Elena," Aldrich began, but she placed her fingers against his lips to silence his protest. "If you're truly going to challenge Mortius to single combat for the right to my hand, then I want you to carry this with you. Not as payment for your protection, not as obligation for your sacrifice, but as a promise. If you survive this battle, if you somehow manage to defeat a man who has killed more opponents than most warriors have fought, then I want you to know that my heart already belongs to you completely." The ring felt warm in Aldrich's palm, as if it still carried the love that had blessed Elena's parents' marriage. He understood the magnitude of her gift, not just the physical object, but the trust and hope it represented. She was giving him something to fight for beyond duty or honor, something personal and precious that made survival feel essential rather than merely preferable. "What if I lose?" Aldrich asked, though the question felt like betraying the confidence Elena needed from him. "Then this ring will remind you, in whatever moments you have left, that you chose love over safety, courage over compromise. That's more than any woman has the right to ask from any man, and more than I ever dared dream someone would offer for me and Marcus." The preparations for single combat followed ancient protocols that had governed such challenges for centuries. Aldrich selected his finest blade, a sword that had belonged to 7 generations of Ravencrest kings and had never known defeat in honorable battle. His armor was the ceremonial plate that bore his family's arms, polished to mirror brightness that would catch sunlight and show his house's colors clearly to all witnesses. But it was Elena's ring, threaded onto a chain and worn next to his heart, that provided the real protection he carried into battle. The physical weight was negligible, but the emotional significance gave him focus that no amount of training could have achieved. Marcus had insisted on helping Aldrich prepare, his small hands checking buckles and straps with the serious concentration of someone who understood that details mattered in important moments. The boy's presence reminded Aldrich that this fight was about more than winning Elena's hand. It was about protecting a child's future and proving that love could triumph over legal technicalities and political convenience. "Are you scared?" Marcus asked as Aldrich made final adjustments to his sword belt. "Yes," Aldrich replied honestly, remembering his own childhood need for adults to tell him the truth about difficult situations. But being scared doesn't mean you can't be brave. It means you're brave enough to do what's right, even when it might cost you everything. Will you win? I'm going to try my hardest, Marcus. And I'm going to remember that I'm fighting for the most important things in my life, you and your mother. The challenge itself was issued in the Great Hall before witnesses from both kingdoms, following formalities that ensured no one could later question the combat's legitimacy. Morteus accepted with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a personal duel, his scarred hands flexing within those black iron gauntlets as he anticipated adding another victory to his collection. "How refreshing," Morteus commented when Aldrich announced the terms. "It's been months since anyone was foolish enough to challenge me to single combat. I was beginning to think all the honor had drained out of modern kingship." "Perhaps you've simply been intimidating the wrong kings," Aldrich replied, his voice carrying none of the uncertainty he felt. "Some men value what they protect more than they fear what they might lose. We'll see how much you value Princess Elena when my sword is at your throat," Morteus said, his smile promising cruelty regardless of the combat's outcome. "Though I admit, watching you die for her will provide excellent motivation for her future cooperation." The words crystallized Aldrich's understanding of what he faced. This wasn't simply a battle for Elena's hand. It was a fight to prevent her from spending the rest of her life knowing that someone she loved had died because of her. A psychological weapon Morteus would use to ensure her complete submission. Elena's ring pressed against Aldrich's chest as he bowed formally to conclude the challenge ceremony, its presence reminding him that some things were worth any risk, any sacrifice, any price that victory might demand. The field of combat stretched between the two armies like a stage where destiny would be written in blood and steel. Aldrich and Morteus faced each other across 50 yards of trampled earth, each man representing not just personal ambition, but the fundamental question of whether love could triumph over law, whether honor could defeat cruelty. Morteus wore armor as black as his reputation, its surface decorated with the crowned skulls of enemies who had dared oppose him. His sword was a massive two-handed blade that had cleaved through the defenses of 5 kingdoms, its dark metal seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. But it was his crown, the shattered remains of Shadowmere's original royal circlet, deliberately broken and reformed with jagged edges that spoke most clearly of his character. The crown told the story of Morteus's rise to power, forged from the fragments of the dynasty he'd overthrown in his own kingdom before expanding his conquest to neighboring realms. Each broken piece had been carefully fitted together with bands of black iron, creating a twisted parody of royal authority that celebrated destruction rather than protection. "Look upon your champion, princess," Morteus called across the field, his voice carrying clearly to where Elena stood with Marcus behind the gathered nobles. "See how small he appears when stripped of his castle walls and reduced to the simple mathematics of blade against blade." Aldrich ignored the taunt, focusing instead on his opponent's stance and movement patterns. Morteus was larger and clearly experienced in personal combat, but there was something in his approach that suggested reliance on intimidation and brute force rather than refined technique. The signal to begin came from a horn blown by neutral observers, its clear note cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. Both men advanced with the cautious respect that seasoned warriors showed when facing unknown opponents, each testing the other's reflexes and defensive patterns. Morteus struck first, his massive blade descending in an overhead attack that would have split a lesser warrior from crown to groin. But Aldrich had anticipated the obvious opening move, sliding aside while his own sword carved a shallow line across his opponent's ribs. First blood to the Alpha King, though barely enough to stain steel. "Lucky," Morteus growled, his follow-up strike coming faster than his size should have allowed. But Aldrich was already moving, his footwork carrying him around Mortius's guard, while his blade sought gaps in the black armor. The ring Elena had given him seemed to pulse against his chest, providing focus that kept his mind clear despite the deadly dance they performed. The battle settled into a rhythm of advance and retreat, each man probing for weaknesses while guarding against devastating counterattacks. Mortius fought with the brutal efficiency of someone who had never needed to preserve his opponent's life, while Aldrich employed the more measured approach of a ruler who understood that unnecessary killing served no purpose beyond satisfying bloodlust. It was Mortius's arrogance that created the opening Aldrich needed. Overconfident in his size advantage, the Shadowmere King committed fully to a horizontal sweep that would have severed Aldrich's spine if it had connected. Instead, Aldrich dropped beneath the blade's path and drove his sword upward, finding the gap where Mortius's breastplate met his arm guard. The wound was serious, but not immediately fatal, sending blood streaming down Mortius's left arm while compromising his ability to maintain full control of his heavy weapon. But rather than retreat or acknowledge the injury, Mortius roared with rage and launched himself forward in a berserker's fury that abandoned all defensive consideration. Aldrich's training saved him from the wild assault, his disciplined footwork keeping him just beyond the reach of increasingly desperate attacks. But as Mortius's strength began to fade from blood loss and exhaustion, his tactics grew more dangerous rather than less so. "If I cannot have her, then no one will." Mortius snarled, attempting to grapple Aldrich, and drag them both to the ground where his superior weight might compensate for his compromised sword work. But Elena's ring against Aldrich's chest reminded him what he fought to protect, and the memory of Marcus's trusting face gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Instead of resisting Mortius's grapple, Aldrich used his opponent's momentum against him, guiding the larger man's charge while positioning his sword for a strike that would end the combat decisively. The blow took Mortius through the heart, piercing the black armor and the cruel spirit it protected. As the Shadowmere King fell, his shattered crown rolled away across the blood-stained earth, its broken pieces finally separated as comprehensively as the kingdom he'd built through conquest and terror. Aldrich stood over his fallen opponent, breathing hard but victorious, Elena's ring warm against his chest, and the knowledge that love had indeed proven stronger than law, filling him with exhausted triumph. Across the field, Elena's cry of relief and joy told him that the most important battle of his life had been won. The Unity Chalice had not been used in living memory, gathering dust in the deepest vault beneath Ravencrest Keep, alongside other relics of diplomatic ages long past. Forged from silver mined in neutral territory and inscribed with prayers for peace in 7 different languages, the ancient ceremonial cup represented the highest form of political reconciliation, a binding covenant that could transform enemies into allies through shared ritual and mutual commitment. Aldrich's victory over Mortius had created a power vacuum in Shadowmere that threatened to destabilize the entire region. 3 of Mortius's generals had already declared competing claims to the throne, while neighboring kingdoms positioned themselves to exploit the chaos. But it was Elena's suggestion, made during the 3rd, sleepless night after the battle, that offered a path toward lasting peace rather than merely delayed warfare. "The people of Shadowmere aren't evil," she said as they sat together in the moonlit garden where they'd first acknowledged their feelings for each other. "They've suffered under Mortius's tyranny just as surely as the kingdoms he conquered. They deserve the chance to rebuild rather than face invasion from opportunistic neighbors." Aldrich's injuries from the combat were healing well under Merrin's careful attention, though the deep cut across his ribs would leave a permanent scar to match the one he'd carried since youth. More challenging was the emotional exhaustion that followed such intense conflict, the way victory felt hollow when achieved through violence, even when that violence had been necessary. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, though he suspected Elena's diplomatic mind had already formulated a comprehensive solution. a unity ceremony. Use the old rituals to formally join our kingdoms in alliance rather than conquest. Offer the people of Shadowmere a chance to choose their own leadership while providing the security they need to make that choice safely. The Unity Chalice required specific conditions to invoke its binding power. Both rulers must drink from it willingly. Their blood mixed with wine, pressed from grapes grown in soil, blessed by representatives of at least 3 different faiths. The ceremony created obligations that transcended personal preference, a magical and legal bond that made betrayal literally impossible for those who participated. Marcus had appointed himself as Aldrich's chief advisor during the complex negotiations that followed Elena's proposal. His 6-year-old perspective often cutting through adult complications with startling clarity. Why don't the Shadowmere people just pick a nice king instead of a mean one? Marcus asked during one particularly frustrating discussion about succession protocols. Because choosing leaders isn't that simple, little knight, Aldrich explained patiently. Sometimes the people with the strongest armies aren't the ones who would be best at taking care of everyone. Then why don't we teach them to pick better? Mama says you can learn anything if someone explains it properly. The innocent wisdom in Marcus's suggestion sparked an idea that transformed their approach to the entire situation. Instead of simply preventing chaos in Shadowmere, they could actively support the development of governance that served people rather than exploiting them. Elena threw herself into the project with the passionate intelligence that had first attracted Aldrich's attention. Her knowledge of Shadowmere's internal politics, gained during her captivity there, proved invaluable in identifying leaders who had opposed Mortius's methods while lacking the military strength to resist him openly. There's a man named Sir Garrett Thornfield, Elena explained during one of their planning sessions. He was Mortius's treasurer, but only because refusing would have meant death for his family. He's honest, competent, and respected by the merchant classes who actually keep the kingdom functioning. Thornfield. Aldrich's eyebrows rose with surprise. Any relation to you? Eleanor smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her since the battle. My mother's brother. Family I thought was dead because Mortius told me he'd executed all my relatives. Apparently, he found Uncle Garrett too useful to kill, though. He kept him under constant threat. The discovery that Elena had surviving family changed the emotional landscape of their planning dramatically. No longer was she the last lonely remnant of her bloodline. She had connections, people who would remember her parents and could help rebuild what Mortius had destroyed, the Unity Chalice. Ceremony itself took place on the first anniversary of the day. Aldrich had found Elena and Marcus in their broken wagon. Representatives from 12 kingdoms witnessed the ritual, lending their authority to the unprecedented alliance between the Northern Territories and the reformed kingdom of Shadowmere. As Aldrich and Elena drank from the ancient cup, their blood mixing with wine blessed by priests from multiple faiths, he felt the magical binding settle around them like a warm embrace. This wasn't just political necessity. It was the formal recognition of bonds that had already formed through shared danger, mutual respect and growing love. To new beginnings, Elena whispered, her lips still stained with wine and the taste of covenant. To family, Aldrich replied, gathering both Elena and Marcus into an embrace that sealed more than treaties could ever accomplish. The hand-forged wedding bands emerged from Aldrich's personal workshop after weeks of careful crafting, their simple design reflecting his rejection of the elaborate royal ceremonies that had characterized marriages in his family for generations. Instead of precious stones or intricate goldwork, he had chosen plain silver bands inscribed with words that carried more value than any gem. Love transforms all things. Written in the ancient script his mother had taught him during quiet evenings long before crowns and responsibilities had complicated their relationship. Elena discovered him putting the finishing touches on the rings. During one of her evening visits to the workshop, where she'd grown accustomed to finding him when the weight of rebuilding two kingdoms became overwhelming. The simple act of creating something beautiful with his own hands provided Aldrich with peace that no amount of political success could match. "They're perfect," Elena said softly, examining the bands that would soon symbolize their permanent union. "Simple enough for everyday wear, but meaningful in ways that only we understand. I wanted something that would last," Aldrich replied, testing the smoothness of the inscriptions one final time. "Royal ceremonies are performed for audiences, political alliances are made for kingdoms, but these rings are just for us, for the family we're choosing to become." The decision to keep their wedding celebration deliberately modest had sparked considerable debate among Aldrich's advisors, who argued that such an important alliance deserved pageantry that would impress foreign dignitaries and demonstrate the Northern Territory's prosperity. But both Elena and Aldrich had experienced enough of life's fragility to value substance over spectacle. Marcus had been consulted extensively about the wedding plans, his role as the bridge between their separate pasts and shared future, making his approval essential to both adults. The boys' enthusiasm for the formal addition of Aldrich to their family had manifested in detailed suggestions about everything from flower arrangements to the menu for their wedding. "Feast, can we have the ceremony in the moonlit garden?" Marcus asked during one of their planning sessions. "That's where you and Mama first talked about loving each other, and the white roses smell the best at night." The suggestion felt perfect, in ways that elaborate cathedral ceremonies could never match. The garden represented the private space where their relationship had developed, away from political pressures and public scrutiny, where they'd learned to trust each other with vulnerabilities neither had shared with anyone else. Elena's Uncle Garrett had arrived from Shadowmere the week before the wedding, bringing with him a trunk of family treasures that Mortius had claimed as spoils of conquest but never bothered to destroy. Among them was Elena's mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and somehow still beautiful despite years of neglect. "I never thought I'd see this again," Elena whispered, holding the ivory silk against herself and marveling at how perfectly it still fit. "Mama wore it when she married Papa, and her mother wore it before that. I thought it was lost forever when Mortius burned our family castle. Uncle Garrett hid it along with other family treasures," her uncle explained, his weathered face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from preserving something precious through dark times. "I always hoped there would someday be a proper occasion to return it to where it belonged." The wedding ceremony itself took place as the sun set and the white roses began to open, their petals to the approaching darkness. Captain Ironhold served as Aldrich's witness, while Uncle Garrett performed the same role for Elena. Marcus stood between them, holding both rings and taking his responsibilities as ring-bearer with the profound seriousness that children brought to important adult rituals. Elena looked luminous in her mother's dress, the ivory silk seeming to glow in the garden's twilight, while the family locket, no longer hidden but worn proudly, caught the last rays of sunlight. When she walked toward Aldrich between the rose-covered arbors, he felt his chest tighten with emotions that had no adequate words. "Princess Elena Valdris." The officiating priest began, using her full title for the last time. "Do you take King Aldrich Ravencrest as your husband, to rule beside him and share both the burdens and joys of the crown?" "I do," Elena replied, her voice carrying across the garden with quiet certainty. "King Aldrich Ravencrest, do you take Princess Elena as your queen, to protect and cherish her, and accept young Marcus as your heir and son?" "I do," Aldrich said, his eyes never leaving Elena's face as Marcus beamed up at both of them. The simple silver bands slipped onto their fingers as smoothly as if they'd been made to fit, their weight both negligible and profound. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted of moonlight and roses, and the promise of happiness that had seemed impossible just months before. "Now we're really a family," Marcus announced with satisfaction. hugging both adults around their waists, while the small gathering of witnesses applauded their joy. The family portrait commission represented the first time in Ravencrest Keep's history that a royal painting would capture genuine smiles rather than the formal stoicism that had characterized centuries of official artwork. Master painter Willem van Bergen had traveled from the capital specifically to document this unprecedented royal family. His reputation built on an ability to reveal character through careful attention to expression and gesture. "Your Majesty, if I may suggest," Willem said diplomatically during their first sitting, "perhaps we could achieve a more traditional composition." Royal portraits typically emphasize the dignity and authority of the crown, but Aldrich had commissioned this painting for entirely different reasons than his predecessors. Instead of intimidating future subjects or impressing foreign dignitaries, he wanted a record of happiness, proof that the transformation in his life had been real and lasting, something Marcus could look upon years later and remember the love that had shaped his childhood. "Paint what you see, Master Willem," Aldrich replied, his arm around Elena's shoulders while Marcus sat on his lap, the boy's wooden practice sword laid carefully across his knees. "If that happens to include dignity and authority, so be it. But I'd rather you captured the joy." The portrait sessions became family time that all three treasured, an excuse to sit together while Willem worked and talk about everything from Marcus's progress with his sword training to Elena's plans for establishing schools in the reformed Shadowmere territories. These conversations revealed the depth of their partnership, not just romantic love, but shared commitment to building something better than either had inherited. Elena had thrown herself into the work of reconstruction with the passionate intelligence that characterized everything she approached. Her knowledge of both kingdoms, combined with Aldrich's resources and Marcus's infectious optimism about what was possible, had created initiatives that were already showing remarkable success. "The children in Shadowmere haven't had proper schools in years," Elena explained during one of their sessions. "Morteus believed that educated subjects were dangerous subjects, but Uncle Garrett reports that families are traveling for days just to enroll their children in our new programs." "And the former soldiers?" Aldrich asked, knowing that unemployed warriors often became bandits or mercenaries when their lords fell. "Many are joining the reconstruction efforts. Turns out men who know how to build siege equipment are quite good at constructing schools and hospitals when given the opportunity." Marcus had adapted to his new role as Crown Prince with the easy confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. His training with Aldrich continued daily, but now it included lessons in diplomacy, mathematics, and languages, preparation for a future where his authority would rest on competence as much as birthright. "When I'm king," Marcus announced during one of their portrait sessions, "I want to make sure every child has their own wooden sword and someone to teach them how to use it properly." "And what will you teach them to fight?" Elena asked, smiling at her son's earnest planning. "Sadness," Marcus replied without hesitation. "And people who hurt other people just because they can. Aldrich says the strongest knights are the ones who protect people who can't protect themselves." Willem's brush captured these moments with an artist's eye for emotional truth, creating a painting that would indeed be unprecedented in royal portraiture. Instead of distant figures radiating power, his canvas showed a father teaching his adopted son about responsibility, a mother whose strength came from love rather than fear, and a family that had been forged through adversity into something unbreakable. 2 years after their wedding, as Willem applied the final touches to his masterpiece, Aldrich reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment. The feared Alpha King still existed when circumstances required his presence, but that harsh persona now served to protect something precious rather than simply maintaining control through intimidation. "Do you ever regret it?" Elena asked during their final sitting, perhaps reading some shadow of memory in his expression. The life you had before, the simplicity of ruling alone without considering others' happiness. Never, Aldrich replied immediately, meaning it completely. That wasn't living, Elena. It was simply surviving with style. This, he gestured to encompass their son's laughter, Elena's hand in his. The portrait that would preserve their joy for future generations. This is what I was born to protect. Marcus leaned against Aldrich's shoulder, studying Willem's work with the critical eye of someone who understood that family was the most important thing anyone could possess. It looks just like us, he announced with satisfaction. Happy, and indeed Willem van Bergen had achieved something remarkable in his royal commission, a portrait that would hang in Ravencrest Keep's Great Hall, not to intimidate or impress, but to remind everyone who saw it that love could transform even the hardest hearts. That family was a choice as much as an accident of birth, and that the greatest victories were sometimes won not on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when people chose each other despite every reason to remain alone.